Hello, good evening. Hello, and welcome. Welcome in the name of HAU Hebbel am Ufer, and this time also in the name of Akademie of the Arts of the World, Akademie der Künste der Welt in Cologne, to our kick-off discussion, to our start of our series with a title on violence, which is a joint venture between the two institutions. Initiated and curated by Max Jorge Hinderer, who is the director of Akademie der Künste der Welt in Cologne, and me, Margarita Zomu, who is a curator here in HAU, a theory curator. Yes, on violence. What do we want to talk about in this series? We started to think about violence because we realized that our violence is omnipresent in all our discussions at the moment, be it, in our discussion about historically repressed populations and discriminations. But although it is omnipresent, it is rare that it becomes the center of our discussions, something like a point of departure for an understanding of the mechanisms of racial and patriarchal capitalism. And this is what we want to do. We want to develop all the different forms of violence by looking on this. What would it mean to put it in the center for an understanding of the mechanisms of racial and patriarchal capitalism? As Eric Allier and Maurizio Lazzarato are saying in their book, Wars and Capital, violence up to the scale of war is the, as they say, ontological reality of capitalism. A reality that has been showing itself through the violence of the state, in military conflicts, as much as in the dispossession and dehumanization of racialized, feminized, and if you want, naturalized subjects. For example, on the first glance, Putin's war attack against Ukraine seems old-fashioned, right? It speaks the language of empires and zones of influence, and it seems like a rupture, like somehow breaking the taboos of our current certainties. But what if we understand Putin's war not as a rupture, but as a continuity, in a way as a continuity of this ontological reality of violence, a continuity that exposes the principles that guide the political and geopolitical arena. Isn't war a continuation of the logic of political sovereignty, conceived from the outset, from the beginning, as purely national sovereignty? Isn't it a continuation of the colonial and extractivist logic that, for the purpose of exploiting human and natural resources, has been destroying the political autonomy of a lot of countries and historically marginalized population, and has been damaging irretrievably our ecologies? And is it not a continuation of a patriarchal logic that constructs a toxic masculinity and educates us into an embodiment of brutality and violence in the name of the manhood of the nation state? A patriarchal logic that initiates us into a masculinity through what the Argentinian feminist anthropologist Rita Segato calls the pedagogy of cruelty. And how can we relate this soldierly masculinity, what Teveleis calls soldatische Männlichkeit, to what Elsa Dorlin, our guest today, is calling in her lecture on the dimension of patriarchal violence? And the lecture is the first part of our discussion. It is in our both online programs, online. So what she calls a deadly state which renders invisible, she says, the continuum between sexist, patriarchal, and capitalist forms of violence. So what if following Elsa Dorlin, we try to make visible this continuation. We try to make visible the continuation of all these different forms of violence and put this continuum in the center of the analysis of our current affairs. So this movement that Elsa does to draw connections between different materializations of violence is one objective of our series, and that is why we really wanted to open with you. But Elsa is also important because of her book, and you know the book if you're here today, Self-Defense, Philosophy of Violence, Selbstverteidigung, eine Philosophie der Gewalt auf Deutsch, where she presented a genealogy of self-defense and thus referred to a field that we called counter-violence, and which is the second important objective in the series. So we want to look at the different forms of violence and its continuum and what counter-violence would mean.
Also, good evening from my side. Thank you, Margarita. As Margarita just pointed out, while historical, hegemonic, and repressive forms of violence are increasingly in the focus of ongoing debates, whether on the colonial continuity structures of patriarchy or contemporary capitalism, the acts of resistance, which were just mentioned, are more and more frequently being characterized as violent and thereby delegitimized. We can think about such polemically charged terms as cancel culture, policing, political correctness, or the destruction of monuments. That's just a few of them we've been hearing a lot in this polemical fashion lately. So while violence on the one hand is being more and more present in our debates, acts of self-defense do appear more and more as delegitimate in the discourses around them. But we have to ask us the question, right? What is considered legitimate and what is considered illegitimate when we talk about violence? At what point is it acceptable to use counter-violence against sexist, racist, extractivist, or economic forms of violence? So in our joint lecture series on violence, we'll be pointing at those and having conversations with our guests in order to analyze these forms of expressions of hegemony, dominance, surveillance, discrimination, physical control, etc. So finally, on violence, our lecture series explores the issue of what it means to talk about violence at the beginning of the 21st century, while also searching for the connections between the various forms of its materialization and expression, and also its lived experience, as we'll be debating today further on. So perhaps it is interesting to describe the format we're trying to apply here with our guests, since we believe that with each one of our guests, and Elsa Dorlin is certainly our perhaps most visible example for that. We have a lot to talk about, and Elsa's book, which was just published, has so much references, and we would rather prefer to really take the time to discuss the different issues. So we decided to invite our guests to have online lectures. We do video recordings of these lectures, as Margarita has just mentioned. Our first lecture on violence with Elsa Dorlin was presented on our media platforms, the website of Theater Hebbel am Ufer, and also the Akademie of the Arts of the World. HAU Hebbel am Ufer, HAU. And we did decide to have a live conversation, including a Q&A and questions of the public in an extra format, also to give it more time and to have the chance to really pursue a study of what we of what it means to talk about violence at the beginning of the 21st century. So in this sense, we're starting our series on violence today with Elsa. And HAU Hebbel am Ufer and the Academy of the Arts of the World will present Fred Moten and Stefano Harni as a follow-up in the month of June 2022. I will introduce Elsa, our guest tonight. Elsa Dorlin is a French philosopher and professor for political contemporary philosophy at the University of Toulouse, Jean Jaurès, in France. She's a specialist in the philosophy of Michel Foucault and also focuses on the research on Black feminist epistemology and Fanonian phenomenology. She was a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Paris 8, and she earned her PhD in philosophy at the Sorbonne, also University of Paris, on the topics of sex, race, and medicine in the 17th and 18th century, with a dissertation with the title Au chevet de la nation, sexe, race et médecine in the 17th and 18th centuries. She also taught history of philosophy and history of science at the philosophy department of the University of Paris 1 at the Sorbonne. And just to mention, her work has been considered as very important and has won several prizes. We'll mention just some of them. In 2009, the French National Center for Scientific Research awarded Elsa the Bronze Medal for her work on feminist theory and philosophy of gender. And in 2017, Elsa Dorlin's book Se Defendre, une philosophie de la violence, which translates in English, as Margarita has mentioned, as self-defense, a philosophy of violence. With that book in 2017, Elsa Dorlin won the Frantz Fanon Book Prize for the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and which will have an English translation through Verso Books publishing, I believe, this year. So in Germany, in the German-speaking context, edited by Surkamp Verlag, we had the same book in its translated title, Selbstverteidigung, eine Philosophie der Gewalt. Welcome to Berlin, to HAU Hebbel am Ufer, HAU 4, and the Academy of the Arts of the World, Elsa Dorlin.
Bonsoir. Je vais juste dire quelques mots avant de commencer. Je voulais vous remercier.
Before I start, I'd like to thank you very much. Thank both of you for inviting me and for the interest you show to my work. I'd also like to thank and to express my gratitude to those two institutions that made this series possible, as well as my coming here. I'm very pleased to be here in that magnificent venue, and I would also like to thank all those persons who are in charge of the technique and also the interpreters who are going to convey the message and the languages. Please excuse that I won't speak in English today, but in order to be as clear as possible, I would rather like to use my mother tongue. Thank you.
So, dear public, you realized she will talk in French. Huh? So I hope you all took your translation devices. Some of you didn't, I saw it. But we will continue in English. So, before we start to comment on your lecture online, I would like to start with a recent case study, a case study that touches on both, I think, on your lecture online, which is actually on patriarchal sexist violence, and also on the question of the self-defense. A case study is something that is actually happening now or happened last week. I'm thankful to the theoretician and gender professor Paula Wieler-Braslavsky that brought this case into my attention 2 days ago, because it has been in the news since 2016. You might have heard about it. It's about Higui. Higui, Argentinian lesbian of color woman in Buenos Aires, who was attacked in 2016 by a gang of men that wanted to do what is sometimes called a corrective rape. I think it's an euphemism, one should call it a punishment rape. She was told things like, now we're going to show you how to feel like a woman, you stupid slut, lesbian, da-da-da. She was beaten on the ground, her clothes were ripped off, and while all this action was going on, she took a knife she had and killed one of the three men. And then police came, etc. And despite the fact that she was like, you could see that her clothes were ripped off, she was bruised, and there was violence involved. And she also reported an attempted gang rape. This fact was never investigated in court by the prosecutor, but instead the prosecutor ordered her detention because she was charged with the potential charges of murder. She was released after 8 months, but not found innocent. And it's only now, last week, on the 25th of March, that the court ordered her that she's finally innocent and her absolvement. And her lawyers said, I think, interesting question, can Higui, a poor black lesbian woman, defend herself against a brutal attack like the one she was subjected to against a corrective rape? Because the right to self-defense, apparently we all have, but she was accused of murder. And in fact, actually your book that is translated also in several languages, also in Spanish and in Portuguese, was mentioned in the media around this case. So people actually referred to self-defense around this case. So I would like to start our discussion by letting you comment on some layers of this very concrete and recent case study of self-defense.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. Concerning Higui, this raises the question of a history that is not part of the official feminist writing of history. It is not very often reported, this case, the secularian history of any practices of self-defense that are enacted and practiced by women and gender minorities and lesbians on a daily basis, every day, in a very concrete way, in a very practical way, without any claim of noble political resistance. They rather consist in a plurality of practices of self-defense in order to escape and to rescue. Se sauver in French has a double meaning. On the one hand, escaping the heteropatriarchal violence, escaping rape, but also means se sauver, saving your life, saving one's life. So we see that there is a strong density of deeds of self-defense that may be invisible and of a very small dimension, and yet they are a positive form of resistance, which is absolutely vital once again. And in the case of Higui, this is a constellation and a context that are specific as far as, first of all, and this is fundamental, the rape as a so-called sexual police is a form of civic police in the case of Higui, but also regarding lesbian bodies and lesbian lives. And for many of those women who are identified as being outside of the gendered norms, or that may oppose resistance to this normalization of bodies, we see in that case that the issue of normalizing violence and rape is used as a systemic means of discipline. And by this I mean that the forms of secession are brought to PED, those who are outside of heteronormativity, by taking ownership on the gendered body, on the body that is supposed to be sexually disposable and rapeable. So to a certain extent, there is this more generical idea that a certain norm of femininity is being defined by the idea that a life may be brutalized and raped. And this would be the very core of femininity. And the second point, which I find very interesting in the case of Higui, is the issue of the judicial scenario and the idea that she was considered as a murder, which calls into question the state justice, a very established judicial machinery which echoes the civil justice of rapists that do justice by themselves via the patriarchy. And so the punishment is doubled as far as she's considered being the cause of violence. In order to be a good victim, she should have been either dead or remain silent and remain still and ask for help, call for help, or turn to a third authority in order to seek help. And as Higui acted outside of that scenario and had no choice but defending herself, to stop a rape, which in a very practical manner often requires an act that is potentially deadly, she takes the form of a killing femininity and monstrous femininity.
I think it's interesting that you talk, so there is disciplinary violence, and I think we can even find it also with the more acknowledged historical examples of political self-defense, right? We will talk about it later. But what you talk about this script, the justice script, and it's interesting. Yeah, we still like in the articles I read about it. Of course, everyone said that it needed the movement against femicides. It needed the movement, the mobilizations, in order for her, after so many years, to be actually found innocent. And I think is interesting if we look at the juridical part of things, that is really not that easy. In your book, you say that the act of defense from the side of the subaltern ends to be judged as violence. Not as self-defense, but as violence, right? Like with her. And I think it's interesting because we have the right for self-defense in our laws. In Germany, it's called Notwehr. It has another word than Selbstverteidigung, self-defense. And it's actually written down in the law. It's not that it's not written down. So that is why I say it's difficult to understand what exactly is the problem. So in French and in English, they don't have this. In the book, there is this difference between Notwehr and Selbstverteidigung. In French and in English, I think it's legitimate self-defense and illegitimate self-defense. And I would like to ask you about the difference. What is the difference for you between this juridical tradition of the legitimate self-defense and what you are actually talking about in the book when you refer to the historical tradition of self-defense of the oppressed? And if you think that this legitimate versus illegitimate is, in juridical terms, is something that would help us to distinguish between the two.
C'est tout l'enjeu de la réflexion sur c'est l'enjeu de se défendre. C'est sur d'identifier la violence comme
that aims at identifying violence within contemporary political philosophy and critical theories, but also to a broader extent in the public space, identifying the issue of violence as being part of an ideological struggle in order to define its meaning and also to lay the ground for a privileged speaker entitled to decide upon what is violent and what is not violent, and to draw a semantic line between the meanings of the struggles. And this fight is historically determined by class antagonism, by the color line, and also by reaffirming the patriarchal privilege of defining that what is and defining the limits of reality. And this is what we see in the case of Higui in particular, but also more generally, you mentioned femicides. We see that the wording of femicide, having it applied, is already a political struggle against a form of secular derealization of violence against the bodies. So qualifying a deed of femicide is, per se, I think, in the discourse, a very strong weapon with a strongly material and corporal dimension in order to realize a power relationship. And as we have seen in France, among others, in the case of domestic sexist killings, they were often called news items or couple tragedies or fights within the couple. And so we see how strong words are in order to derealize those deeds. Yet we see that law is a privileged channel to qualify reality and to grasp reality through a system of categories that first of all qualifies a fact and then draws separation lines between that what is legal, illegal, that what is just and unjust. In the case of legitimate defense, this issue is part of a history of violence. Because in the end, this quality as legitimate defense means this was not violence, this was a legitimate use of force, for example, in a situation where somebody was defending himself. But we see that looking at the genealogy of this legal political construction of self-defense, there is a separation line between the violence that is always already legitimate and another part of violence and of deeds that is always called violent and unlegitimized. So I differentiate between, on the one hand, the legitimate defense, which is a legal and political construction, and on the other hand, the self-defense, which is a vital act and a phenomenology of vital action, What do the grey archives of resistance tell us when we take the perspective of the memory of those who had no other choice but using their own body and enacting violence in order to survive? So this is the differentiation in the concept. On the one hand, you have the legal history, and on the other hand, you have the political phenomenology, which is also a genealogical work, according to Foucault, but also an ontological work in order to bring a new reality. Thank you.
Yes, I would, we said it also before, that in order, in a way, so there is the legal field, and then there is historical genealogy of fights, who may or may not be influential in establishing new relations also of power and violence. And you mentioned the archive of resistance, being part of these forces that establish new relations or new limits of what is violence and what is not violence, or what is violence and what is defending itself. And in the book, what we see is, of course, this genealogy of an archive of resistance and the collective self-defense, if you want. You start the book with how indigenous people and black people were systematically disarmed in order for them not, in a way, be able to self-defend themselves. You say they were disarmed because of the, quote, permanent fear of the colonizers, of the efficacy of the resistance practices of the slaves. And we have that a lot. Butler says that, or Fanon, that actually you have someone whom you have disarmed, whom you have controlled, whom you have dominated, and this person is a ticking bomb all the time. This person might be completely paralyzed. You describe it in the book when Fanon says this person has a paralyzed body, but in his dreams all the time, dreams of fighting back, and is a body that is a ticking bomb, is in constant tension of his muscles, and is a body that is always ready to rise up, has a resentment, and is ready to fight. And so I ask myself, I would like to know more about the relation between the self-defense and the potential insurrection, the potential resistance. Because I ask, like, it's a simple question, do you think that this fear, that the subaltern self-defense at the end will end up in an insurrection, at the end will have a political consequence, maybe a change of the existence order of power relation? Is this the reason why this self-defense, is this fear, why the fear of the insurrection, the reason why this self-defense is always considered as violence?
Ben là,
Well,
je le disais, il n'y a pas. La première chose, c'est que il n'y a pas la question de la légitime,
the question of legitimate or illegitimate defense,
c'est une question qui est fermée.
if violence is legitimate or not, is a biased question, because you can only answer that question in a framework of analysis that is only interested in text or with that is only referring to the question of the rule of law, and they look only at its metropolitan history. But for another reality, for the whole part of reality, for other memories, for other lives. The question of legitimacy or the illegitimacy of violence is not a question that you can ask. It's a kind of luxury to ask that question, and the question of self-defense was linked to survival, pure and simple. So what I tried to do is to position myself in political philosophy, in critical philosophy, and to do so from the position of the empire and of the colonial history of the empire. And from that history, to look at the archives and to show the conflictuality of these relationships. So when we talk about the legitimacy of violence, or when we talk of political insurrections, where we position ourselves in a continuum with the history of slavery, with slave fights, slave riots, until modern struggles that we see now. And we are the heirs of these struggles. So we see that first, we should not wonder about the legitimacy, because there is the law that decides before us which act is going to be encoded politically and legally as a defensive act, and which act is being considered as hysterical, as insurrectional, as criminal. And we'll still see that today. We see that there is a border that is being drawn in France between the periphery of cities. What happens in those neighborhoods, it is automatically considered as irrational violence. Any mobilization, be it individual or collective, those mobilization for the conditions of life is being considered as apolitical, as being the act of savages, and is considered a threat for the rule of law. So I'm really interested in that fracture. Second point, we should also do a philosophy of the state from its imperial history. So this territory of colony as a territory for experimenting a new type of governmentality. So those technologies have been experimented in that space, in the colonial space, and came back to the metropole and have been generalized in the metropole in many ways. Another question, and I come back here to Fanon, because Fanon is a major author here. You ask, when does self-defense or violence, this violence that allows myself to live on a daily basis, when does it become an insurrectional act? So if we look at the phenomenology of violence as Fanon uses it in the rest of the earth, it is a philosophy of the body as a body that is controlled in a space where each movement is coerced, is forced, is hindered. He describes the colonial city, so he talks about Algiers, that is controlled by the French state and by the French colonial regime, and we see that their colonized are being kept in, and everybody is coerced, so that those bodies are bodies who are ruminating, who are dreaming of running, of jumping, but they are permanently under the white gaze and under this colonial pressure. So what I tried to do is to show that before the question of political clash, there is a question of a form of politicization through rumination that is a constant projection of what I do the day where I will be able to. And in some way, it's a philosophy that thinks It's a kind of philosophy of the muscle. What is a coerced muscle? If there is a pressure on my arm, for example, and that this pressure is being taken away, then my arm jumps automatically. It's a movement of force and counterforce, and it is this idea of explosion that is a political momentum, but will also be pre-political, infra-political. And what I've tried to do is to look at this form of politicization when muscles are being politicized, where cells are being politicized, to show that the political starts here in the intimacy of our imaginaries, the way we imagine vengeance, revenge.
Thank you very much, Elsa. I wanted to draw the attention in our discussion towards some of the elements that you discussed further on in our lecture, which precedes this conversation tonight. And one of the crucial aspects you've been already mentioning, we've been talking about it, Margarita, is the dimensions of violence along certain lines, right? What is considered legitimate, illegitimate, along certain lines that define the subjects that are subjugated to let's say, all forms of repressive violence, be it the state, be it the civilian, civic violence, as in the case of Iggy and what we've been discussing. So I wanted to draw attention to two things, actually, that you insist on in the lecture on violence a week ago, that was published a week ago online. I really hope everyone had the chance to see it. However, just to sum up, I would say that one of the key aspects that you mentioned is the lived experience of violence, right? And that in the lived experience of violence, also the differentiation along certain lines, be it racialized lines, be it genderized lines, class difference, these differences exist, and a very important thing to understand is that the lived experience, the experience lived of lived violence, is structural to how a reaction of a law or of the legitimization or delegitimization of a counter-violence could be, right? So even the fact to condemn to having been subjugated to any kind of violence depends on which side of the difference of the experience of violence one stands. So I would like to ask you about this crucial difference of an experience of violence that you analyze in your lecture. And therefore, I would like to ask you if you agree that if racial and patriarchal violence and class violence do compose a system, we can call it modernity, we can call it capitalism, we can call it colonial imperialism. So if these different forms of violence that play together compose a system, where could we situate the constructed difference in the experience of violence, if not in that very same system? How would you say is the constructedness of the experience, which you just now related as an cause and effect that is almost mechanical or muscular, how far is the experience of violence part of the system already that executes violence?
Mais il n'y a pas de violence. Moi, j'appréhende effectivement la violence du côté de l'expérience vécue.
I'm interested in violence from the side of lived experience, and this is really what I'm interested in and what I'm engaging with. And to start with the question that is beneath the lived experience of violence. What is beneath that question is that there is a framework of intelligibility.
Qui va pour moi-même me
historically, that leads to the fact that I myself, I approach this experience as an experience of violence, and I perceive this experience as an experience of violence. There is no lived experience that could be pure, where I could choose myself, okay, this is a lived experience of patriarchy, this is a lived experience of class antagonism, this is a lived experience of racism. So I really try to go beyond that and not only to use an analytical approach which would isolate artificially some aspects, because I think it's more a continuum of different forms of violence. And with this, the idea that the point of view, the perspective of use or we use to define violence, to define what is violence and what is not violence, and what should be lived as violence and what should not be experienced as violence. This perspective is a perspective of the subject that has been spared mostly within this continuum of violence. It is a subject that is being protected from the effects of structural violence that is embedded in a continuum. And this continuum could be understood as a capitalist way of producing that is deeply colonial and patriarchal. I refer here to this distinction between spared lives and the question of exposed lives, lives that are exposed to violence, that are experiencing violence, and for which there is no rupture somehow. And the other point that is very important for me is that it refers to a debate within feminist philosophy and in many Afro-American or Caribbean texts or texts written by persons of African descent. So it was a fundamental debate that is still being carried on about the definition of sexism or the definition of patriarchy. And in this frame, how you define what is sexism, what was used to define sexism, mostly in many parts of feminism or of US feminism, of white feminism, what was used to define this was the lived experience of white women belonging to the middle class or to the upper class. So it was the violence, the sexist violence lived by white women. So I don't want to minimize their experience of sexism. And I think that this critique was like a theoretical explosion. It's about destituting the white solipsism within feminism that leads to the fact that we define patriarchal violence only from the point of view of the lived experience of white middle-class women who are experiencing the violence of patriarchy, but they experience only a part of the patriarchal violence, and they are spared in many ways. So the question that is present in all those texts,
des expériences marginalisées, des expériences
so in those texts that present experiences from the margin, marginalized experiences that we should put back into the center. This is what Bell Hooks is saying, and it is also very present in the text of Patricia Hill Collins or also of Kimberly Crenshaw. This idea that the margins are margins of the unintelligibility. These margins are experiences that are made invisible, and we don't even have the words in the center, to make them real and to put them at the core of a perspective that would show sexism in a more global way, that would show, and that sexism is clearly linked to the capitalist way of production. It's also linked to the colonial character of patriarchal capitalism. So I think we should think in that direction. And I've tried to historicize those lived experiences in order to identify this continuum and to find this continuum. And something else that is very important for me methodologically is to not only approach lived experiences of violence that are narrative or only at a discursive level. So the question is, how can we talk about those different lived experiences of violence? How can we talk about it? I take an example that is also taken from the history of feminism. When we look at violence against bodies, the question of the reproductive ability of bodies. In the history of nation states, we see that white women historically have been assigned to a sexual reproductive work with a system of punitions when they were using contraception. It means that abortion has been criminalized, and also other practices have been criminalized, because these women are subjected to violence that wants them to reproduce the nation, to reproduce a white nation. That was the case in the US, but also in a state like France. So we saw that at the same time we had this injunction for white women, while women of color, colonialized women, were subjected until recently to public policy trying to sterilize them. So we had here very discriminatory politics concerning their social rights and their rights to have a family and to be mothers. So when the feminist movement only talks, when it talks about reproductive rights, of the right to abort, and that this question of the right to abort is not inscribed in a more general topic of how certain women cannot reproduce. So we see that some women are being criminalized for having tried to abort, while others are being sterilized against their will. So we need a political consciousness that can bring both sides into feminism. So within the feminist movement, there is a conflictuality about the political subject of feminism. Who speaks? Who can say what is the experience and what are the claims that we'll make from there? So there's really this question of shared experiences of violence, and sometimes some experiences cannot be heard from different point of view.
Thank you very much, Elsa. I wanted to dig in a bit deeper in that. What is the margin of intelligibility? What is possible to be heard? What is possible to be seen? What is the parameter on which we can actually, start to define what violence would be, thus also its legitimacy or illegitimacy? And you've been talking about those protected subjects and the investment into protect certain subjects, again, along racialized, genderized lines. Those protected subjects from the experience of violence, or that there is a, constructed difference in the experience, the lived experience of violence. Now, as we know from the 18th century philosophers, the very basic parameters, Central European philosophers, very basic parameters for experience are space and time, considered to be, space, time. And now it's interesting to think about the body as space, to think about experience also as something that develops in time. We have spoken about the time bomb, right, that the oppressed body is, because as Judith Butler says in the prologue to your Brazilian edition, translation of your book in its Brazilian edition, Judith Butler speaks of the necessary act of violence as a pursuit of one's own existence, right? So these forms of necessary violence in order to exist, they are only describable from a certain perspective, and they seem illegitimate from the perspective of hegemony. So now I wanted to speak about space and time. On one hand, we have a time of the individual lived experience, but we also have historical time. And within historical time, the body, which is the organ, let's say, that provides us with the experience of outside affection and violent interaction with ourselves, the body has been this a scenery of different forms of enacting violence of the dominant forces on the individuals and on the subjects. Violence, you start your book on self-defense with making reference to Michel Foucault's Surveiller Punir, and Discipline and Punishment in English, which starts with 3 pages that are extremely cruel and violent description of the execution of Robert François Damiens, a person that was considered to be mentally unstable and who had tried to kill the French king in 1757. So that same year he gets executed by drawing and quartering, which can be imagined as one of the most cruelest forms of torture, right, on a body. And Michel Foucault uses this one case to speak about the historical moment in which drawing and quartering, which means that form of torturous punishment to death, fades away in French law. And the very case of Robert François Damiens would have been the last case of a judgment trial with the execution by drawing and quartering. So this last execution of show violence would constitute a moment in the Foucauldian narrative of, let's say, other forms of punishment and of state violence, how it enacts. In an interview some years later, Michel Foucault would speak about that the relations of violence would have migrated from the outside to the inside of the body, something he identifies as the era of discipline and the birth of the so-called society of discipline. Now, interesting enough, you, at the beginning of your book, contrast this situation at the main square in Paris with a show trial in the colonies in Guadeloupe. And I want to just explain a bit further also why it is important to contrast the experience of a show trial in Paris with one in the colonies. It has to do with space and time as parameters for a possible experience, and what are the margins of the intelligibility of how violence is constituted and how the experience of violence is constituted. So, for example, in 1757, the last execution by drawing and quartering takes place in France, according to Michel Foucault. But we know, for example, in the Latin American context, that 24 years later, in 1781, the Quechua rebellion leader Tupac Amaru II gets executed by drawing and quartering by the Spanish colonial powers. It's interesting to mention that because we can see that while in France the idea of these show trials and show punishment extinct in a historical period, and liberalism takes birth and it's a system of punishment, the relations of violence do not only migrate to the inside of the body, but they are also exteriorized, tertiarized, outsourced to the margin, not only of the imperial system, that means to the colonies, but also to the margin of intelligibility, because those subjects which are protected from the experience of violence also get deprived through a genderized, racialized, and class difference of the possibility to understand how violence operates on the experience of these othered subjects along the lines of gender, race, and class. However, while Robert François Damiens was the last case of a show trial and execution by drawing and quartering in Central Europe, 24 years later, the execution of Tupac Amaru II is considered to be by an eyewitness the first case of an execution by drawing and quartering in the Viceroyalty of Peru. So there's a historical shift. You, in the beginning of your book, you also speak about a show trial that occurs after the supposed end of show trials in the center of the empire in Paris. But they do show up and surface at the margin of the visibility and intelligibility of the inhabitants of the center of the empire, right? Living in Central Europe. So I wanted to ask you if you could explain furthermore on what you have debated and analyzed in your video lecture, which is what you call the incommensurability of the experience of violence. Could you explain more about this incommensurability?
Je vais revenir après sur incommensurabilité des expériences.
Well, I will come back to the incommensurability of the violent experiences, but this later on, because this is exactly the prologue of my book, Self-Defense, with this comparison drawn out of Surveiller et punir, and this example in Guadeloupe when the Napoleon troops restore slavery and kill the ongoing uprisals. And one of the tortures that is used in the public space in Guadeloupe, that is imported from the Portuguese and British colonies, that has been traditionally used by a colonial government, not only the French one, but also used by other governments. This is the torture of the iron cage. And this is what I meant there. It is about an iron cage in which a person is in cage. I here describe the fate of Milo de la Girardière, who is a rebel, and he is into an iron cage which has been used to all and applied to all the rebels that were sentenced to death. So he's within this iron cage, Milo de la Girardière, and both legs are on some supports, and in the middle there is a very sharp iron blade, and he has to stand upright because on those stirrups, because if he falls down and if he weakens, he will fall down and get injured on that sharp blade, and his genital will be the first part of his body that will be injured, and the internal face of his legs. So this is the system that is applied very commonly, usually in the colonies, in order to restore the order, the slavery, and the Napoleonian authority. So this is the system that is compared to discipline and punishment. And this is distinct from the quartering system of Damien, because in the case of Damien, the sovereign power was interested in showing how magnificent it was and showing the quartering of the one who hit the community to bring or to reinforce the cohesion of the public. So here there is a demonstration of power, but what is happening is that Milo de la Gérardière, being tired, hungry, thirsty, will unavoidably fall down and get injured, and in a reflex movement his body will stand up again for a few hours or a few minutes before he will fall again, and he will get up and fall again, and in the end he will die. But the way in which he dies is that he's killing himself. His weakness, the fact that he's getting weaker and weaker, leads to a powerlessness that will cause his death. So what this mechanism says is that the more you resist, the more you're defending yourself, the more you try to defend yourself against injury and death, the more you will die. And this kind of system, this kind of apparatus, using Foucault's vocabulary, is being experimented, or this kind of apparatus is a form of governance over the bodies that internalizes the idea according to which the more I defend myself, the more I will be beaten. And this is a very interesting sentence, a very interesting message at the beginning of the modern era. Then it criminalizes the self-defense. We should not think about self-defense as a violent act used in order to immediately defend myself, in order to save my life. Self-defense is a genuine move to self-preservation, to the conservation of my own life, including the most passive deeds like feeding myself, leading a livable life, breathing the air without getting poisoned, drinking drinkable water. My body is the medium through which I remain alive, and the body turns into an opponent or an enemy. And this body, this violence, this vital move that goes through my body turns into a self-killing movement that exposes me to the risk of death. And this is a statement, this is a message that characterizes a kind of colonial governance that has been generalized in the mainland countries. And this is a form of domesticity, of discipline that uses the idea that I incorporate self-discipline, I prevent, I block this conatus, this move, vital move that ensures the possibility of my own life. So when you see such apparatuses, such systems that criminalized as conceptualized in the biopower, those lives that are being maximized, those lives which livability is being maintained, whereas a separation line is drawn between some exposed to the risk of dying in a continuous way. We see that those lives that are being maximized we strengthen the ability to lead your life on the one hand, and the other lives are being disarmed, are turned into defenseless lives that are not anymore in a position to ensure the conditions of their lives, that are facing the risk of dying, and also those lives are produced in a form of powerless subjectivity with the interiorized fact that if I defend myself, I will be beaten. So the uprisal in us is being domesticated also. And the drawing line by Foucault is the race, the racial line. And this has to do with the very imperialistic question of imperialism. But we should also bring back this consubstantial issue of biopolitics that is at the outmost colonial and patriarchal, meaning that some lives are exposed to the risk of dying and are produced as defenseless lives, defenceless lives. Those lives are undefendable as far as they are never defended by a state that, on the other hand, defends so-called legitimate lives. So this is the point where I start a very Foucault-like debate that is continuously updated regarding to the, in view of the issue of contemporary biopolitics. But regarding this debate, I also ask a question, which is somehow fundamental, basic. What is the reason why today in the uprisal insurrectional moments and social movements and political movements where people get mobilized and fight for livable conditions of existence and livelihood, what is the reason why we lose in those movements and those fights? That in front of us there is not only a deadly and maximized violence, but also a system and apparatus that leads to the fact that we internalize the fact that our own ability to self-defense is failed, and constantly think, okay, if we do this, repression will be stronger. If we use too much violence, if we defend ourselves against the aggressor, assault, the aggressor will be even more violent. If we defend ourselves against the police, the response will be even more violent, and the potential risk might be deadly. And this is a message that is inside us, within us, and that also leads to the fact that any victim that defended him or herself and was lynched, anybody who said, I cannot breathe, but saw the knee on its chest even stronger, you remember that word, I can't breathe, that was considered being a threat and an assault. This is a message, this is a show that we expose. And so this message is the more you try to survive, and the more surely you will be killed. So what is that message today in the light of a capitalist mode of production that is deadly and that continues being deadly and continues to produce, continues extractivism, massacre, repression? And what does that say? It tells to us that the more we will try to breathe, the more you will try to breathe, the more certainly you'll be defeated.
Elsa, thank you for bringing this up as a mode of question of today, right? And I think you end in your lecture, we started with this disciplinary rape, which has exactly the function of, a pedagogy of cruelty, which you also talk about in the lecture, of the pedagogy of embodying, the do's and the not do's, what you have to say. And you also end your lecture with the pedagogy of Paulo Freire for an intelligibility of lived experience. And maybe I would say, this would be my question, we can come back to feminism and the we, about sharing experiences, you know, but because I think one problem is the being disciplined in an embodiment of obedience and fear, and the other is being, and you both talked about that, being divided. This way of other violences concerning other people is also, of course, a way of dividing lived experience that is then making it more difficult, you know, to formulate a pedagogy that would maybe be a pedagogy of sharing, that would be a pedagogy of empathy, that would be a pedagogy that brings us together instead of us being, again, you know, subjects that cannot, you know, unite in other pedagogies. I would like you to answer this, but of course, we have been talking here 1 hour and 20 minutes already, which is a lot. So I would like to open a bit the light in the audience and make it possible for the audience also to intervene before we come slowly in some possible conclusions or maybe further questions. So, dear public, you've been sitting around so with so much patience. You're invited, and I think that you people that came here really know why you came here tonight. So feel free to participate. There is microphones there where you can go and ask and say something, and it would be, I think, enriching this panel here. You can also think about it, and but please feel invited, and you can always raise your hand, but also just go to the microphone. While we're waiting for you, maybe I reformulate what I was trying to say. So of course, because you brought up this big aporia in the feminist movement about the we, you know, we have a huge problem, if you want, because we have been operating with the subject of the woman, but actually we have to be clear that is not only that can constitute a shared topic on which to organize our feminism, the subject of the woman, the fact that some of us have vaginas or not, is not the only thing, you know, that makes us feminists or where we can organize our feminism around. And I think, you made it very clear. The question, and then you say, for some feminists, their lived experiences was then projected to the state. Also, this is a big part of your lecture, that the state protects us, you know, and now we even talk about carceral feminists, like the feminists that the solution for violence against women or sexist violence is more police, is more punishment, is more years of punishment of men, of the perpetrators, right? There's a whole movement, but we also know that this has always been used also against black men, and there's a whole history of using feminist issues against black men, people of color, right? And again, dividing us in a way. So if I understood you correctly, and this is maybe my question about the pedagogy of shared experiences, how do we create this shared experiences? You say, okay, if we as feminists, we have to look to the feminist issue from the black feminist point of view, from the colonialized female subject, in order to be able to grasp both patriarchy and colonialism, right? So you say our feminism cannot be projected to the state, but we have to actually understand the state as a part of the one that is producing the violence. The violence that is not only physical violence, but is the violence of labor, division of labor, and being put into reproductive labor, and thus being the subject that you said, if you are into the reproductive labor, you become the subject that is more easy to be violent to. As the patriarch, the paterfamilias, who has the right to be violent, right? So what I want to say is yeah, what could be a pedagogy that makes the different forms of violence in a way intelligible, so that we can share them. I just pointed out 2 ways of you to say what we cannot share. For example, the call to the state, we cannot share.
Thanks for this question. To come back to what Max was saying about the incommensurability, I will come back to the dialogue I was talking about in my lecture between Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich. On the question of the incommensurability of the experience of sexism. So Audre Lorde is a poet, is a lesbian, is African American, from the Caribbean, and is a mother. And Adrienne Rich is also a poet, a lesbian, US American, Jewish, and they confront their experience with each other, and they talk. And Adrienne Rich, in this dialogue, talks about the white solipsism that we were talking about within feminism. So the fact that the political subject was a white subject that was ignoring the diversity of experience. So how would it be possible to make commensurable those experiences? In this dialogue, Audre Lorde talks about police violence, and she says that there is a gap, an ontological gap, an ontology of violence, an ontology of Black life and of the exposition to extreme violence that is not intelligible for white lives. So within feminism, the question of police violence concerning Afro-American people is a point of rupture. And it is very clear, and it is interesting to see if the feminist movement as a whole is mobilizing itself within a continuum against violence against women, against femicides, against police violence. Does this movement look at it as a continuum of violence? That would mean somehow that there is a state, a political system that makes those forms of violence lawful. So there is an economy of violence. There's also this idea of a construction of the Black body, of the Black man as a predator or as an aggressor, and the way it has been constructed historically, we see we have to undo it in a tradition that is not saying that we should take the position of Black women. It is incommensurable, but we have to theorize this and politicize this as a critical perspective. Another thing, there is also a perspective that is coming together with feminism of African descent. It is an anarchist tradition, also a tradition of black anarchism. There is not, on the one hand, black thought and white anarchism. On the other hand, there are postures linked to anarchism, and I talk about them in my book when it comes to socialist and internationalist British suffragettes identifying the state as the main enemy, with this idea that we cannot ask for more rights or for more protection, because the state historically is the entity organizing our own vulnerability to violence.
That's interesting. If we then say maybe our common thing could be being against the state. Huh? We have someone who wants to discuss with us. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. My question goes in the same direction. I was wondering if you have an idea, like how maybe a good institutionalization of inter-community solidarity could look like.
Merci beaucoup pour cette question qui est effectivement vitale.
Thank you for this question. That is a vital question for sure.
La réflexion sur une
the reflection on the solidarity between communities, I think there is already a material answer that is being given in different forms of self-organization, with the question of community care and what has been done in the past already. So a certain memory or traces of some traditions of self-defense. And I think here, for example, of the whole genealogy of Black Power that goes into the concretization of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and their 10 points program, which is part of a political self-defense, and it's about self-organization, how to have access to health care, how can we self-organize concerning education, how can we have access to culture. It's about also self-organization concerning food, with food banks, self-organized breakfast in schools. So I'm talking here about the US-American context and in the times of a very brutal segregation. So these 10-point programs, I take it as an example, but I could also take the question of self-organized communities, of queer self-organized communities, or the question of lesbian separatism, or the organization of some neighborhood in France. And with this idea of self-organizing the basic conditions of living. And I think that for me, for that, we need to refuse, to practice refusal, to get out of the systems, to refuse this deadly world, and to try to create together a life. And for that, we have to do together. It's a kind of doing. It's not necessarily about sharing, about talking, about constructing a political subject, about constructing a we, or having great debates, but more is that in the daily life to do together, to care for each other, and to engage our bodies in a political form of love. And with that, I mean to take care of those with whom I'm putting a roof over my head, with whom I'm producing food. So this kind of very prosaic things. And I think it includes different developments also in the Marxist feminism of Silvia Federici about reproducing the reproduction of life and the role of the collective in order to produce livable lives. And for that, we need smaller scales, the scale of a community, a very localized and embodied scale. And in France, we saw how this has been made with the ZAD, with the whole mobilization that was organized there against the building of an airport in France. And it was a great victory of this zone that had to be defended. That was the name of it, ZAD, Zone à Défendre. And there is also a big tradition of squatting in Berlin, for example. And I think that this archive can be a way that we should share this archive in order to embody this.
I won't comment the squatting in Berlin. Because it is really an archive, this movement, and it was not for some years, even before COVID, we had more squats than now. So we also lose these spaces, and if we locate sovereignty in these spaces as a political sovereignty in the doing, then we of course have a complete other way to think what is the political, to think it, because at the moment we are very much defining who talks from which position without localizing sovereignty in the doing and in the common doing. And it's only about speaking, me from my position and you from your position. And of course, this is not something that renders us particularly strong. Is there a last question? Because we are doing this for some time now, and it would be time also to close. This is a clear statement. Max, would you like to? And Elsa?
Perhaps, thank you.
It's just we have to really wrap it up.
We have to wrap it up.
Yeah, it's like a Schlusswort. Yeah,
right.
Like a Schlusswort.
I would like to simply ask you, Elsa, your book is now some years old. The fact that it's only been published 3 years after its first publication in German, then 5 years later in English, in between has been published in last year, I think, in Brazil, or was it the year before? I don't remember. However, perhaps you want to share with us where this journey is taking you. Like, what is your perspective after this reception is becoming international? It's becoming, in jurisprudence, from the civic movements. Your book is being quoted, as we heard, as in the case of Iggy in Argentina, as a reference, for social movements. Where does this take you? What are your plans for the next future, your next publication?
Thank you.
Très rapidement.
Very quickly.
Ce livre aussi, Se Défendre,
This book, Self-Defense, relates the history of my commitment, via my body, my commitment to feminist self-defense and to a practice of uprisal at the scale of my body. And history and memory of women's movements and queer feminist movements of resistance, of subaltern resistance, is very important to me. Those movements who carried out resistance. And today, this book, Self-Defense, and the fact that it's been traveling a lot, as you said, we see that the book was published at the time of the Me Too movement, and later on there was this international mobilization against police violence and racist violence and state violence and racist state policies, also in democracies. After that came the pandemic, which radicalized in me the way in which I see the issue of a form of shifting, which we mentioned earlier, shifting of the deadly regime. We are living in a deadly regime. These are not no vain words. This is no exaggeration. We are concretely, to various extents, exposed also in a different way, from one to the other, exposed to this deadly ruling. And the mode of production is deadly, and it would be necessary to again stand together in order to withdraw the system, to refuse and reject that system. And at the moment, I work on the issue of perception. What is the reason why we perceive the threat or not? And this is highly debated at the moment, together with the concept of denial. So this is the issue I'm currently working on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Elsa.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup à vous deux. Merci infiniment.
I think the moment of déni, refusal against the deadly regime that is founded in a mode of production, this is a good point of departure for this series that will deal with this deadly regime all through. So thank you for that. Thank you for this beginning. Thank you, dear public, for listening for so long. Yes, have a nice evening.